Nope. We're doing 1 and 2. I gotta save my voice for teaching, you know. I like being up here. I can just say what we're doing. That's right. Heir of the Kingdom. So I'm hoping the song comes to me as Fran starts playing. And we will all sing loud. If I don't hear you singing, you got to stand up. Heir of the kingdom, oh, why dost thou slumber? Why art thou sleeping so near thy blessed home? Wake thee, arouse thee, and gird on thine armor. Speed, for the moments are hurrying on. Heir of the kingdom, say, why dost thou linger? How canst thou tarry in sight of the prize? Up and adorn thee, Savior is coming. Haste to receive him, descending the skies. Earth's mighty nations in strife and commotion tremble with terror and sink in dismay. Listen, 'tis not but the chariot's loud rumbling. Heir of the kingdom, no longer delay. Stay not, oh stay not, for earth's vain allurements. See how its glory is passing away. Break the strong fetters the foe hath bound o'er thee. Heir of the kingdom, turn thee away. Keep the eye single, the head upward lifted. Watch for the glory of earth's coming King. Lo, the mountaintop's light is now breaking. Heirs of the kingdom, rejoice ye and sing. Thank you. Yeah, we didn't hear you singing, so you got to stand up for the next part.
That means, hello, my name is Lucia. A lot of people don't know my real name. Instead, they call me and my family caminantes. In English, that means people who walk. Why do they call us that? Where I come from, life is very hard. There is no food or medicine or school. My mom wants a good life for me, so she packed our bags and we started walking. We walk across mountains. We walk in the hot and the cold, the rain and the sun. We sleep on the street when it is nighttime. Sometimes it is fun adventure. Other times I'm scared and tired and just want to go home. But we keep walking and searching for a good place to live. It is not easy, but we are thankful for the nice people who help us. They give us food and water. They give us medicine and rest. And when we find our new home, they will even help me go to school. I hope we find our new home soon.
ADRA is doing incredible work to support immigrants and refugees around the world. They provide essential services like food, shelter, education, and health care to families who've been displaced by conflict, natural disasters, or other challenges. ADRA not only meets immediate needs, but also helps refugees and immigrants rebuild their lives by offering long-term support and training. ADRA is making a real difference in the lives of people who are starting over in new places, often under difficult circumstances. When you give to the mission offering, a portion of that offering helps fund ADRA's important work around the world. Thank you for your generous support.
Good morning. All right, let's open with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you so much for allowing us to come worship you on this wonderful day. Thank you for the Sabbath and for the rest that you have instructed us and given to us. Please be with those that are still on their way or those that aren't able to come today. Please especially give them a blessing and touch their bodies or minds or whatever form of healing they need. And be with us as we go over the lesson. Let us be inspired and learn something new. Amen. The Nations, Part 1. Dum dum dum. All right, so our memory text comes from Daniel 7:14. And it is, "Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed." All right, so the book of Revelation shows us God's solution for our fallen world. In the final chapters, access to the tree of life is restored, the curse is lifted, and we are readmitted into the presence of God. Revelation, in some ways, is the book of Genesis in reverse, which is why Genesis remains an important key to understanding how the world's problems developed in the first place. One of the key issues in both Daniel and Revelation is worldly government, a succession of human attempts to control a planet that rightfully belongs to God, who will, once this horrible episode of sin and rebellion is over, or rebellion is forever ended, ultimately rule in righteousness. It's a very long process that leads to this moment, covering thousands of years of human experiments in self-government. They have never worked. Even those expressing the highest ideas have always fallen short, often terribly short of these ideas. So much of the sad history of humanity through the millennia is nothing but accounts of the tragedy that these failed systems have brought upon us, and it will only get worse until God's everlasting kingdom finally is established. So that was a lot of words. Be prepared, because there's more. Nimrod and Nineveh. So, Eden was created as the ideal home for the human race. However, once sin entered, God had no choice but to separate humanity from the garden and the tree of life, well, at least for now. While outside the garden, humans were required to work hard to provide for their own continued existence. Life became harder. We had to live with pain and by the sweat of our brow. That's in Genesis 3:16 through 19. Our first parents trusted that the rightful king would provide a path back into the garden, and they brought sacrifices to the gate of Eden in faithful anticipation of the redemption that God, right from the start, offered the fallen world. The Garden of Eden remained upon the earth long after man had become an outcast from its pleasant paths. Hither came Adam and his sons to worship God. Here they renewed their vows of obedience to that law, the transgression of which had banished them from Eden. When the tide of iniquity overspread the world, and the wickedness of men determined their destruction by a flood of waters, the hand that had planted Eden withdrew it from the earth. But in the final restitution, when there shall be a new heaven and a new earth, it is to be restored more gloriously adorned than at the beginning. I find that interesting to read. The Garden of Eden can be restored more gloriously. In my mind, it's already a fantastic place, to see it, but to imagine it even more fantastically adorned, that's something else. Others, however, work on man-made solutions to our newfound problems, and we see the birth of city-states, an attempt to create an easier life, and perhaps to try to recapture what was lost in Eden. So we're going to go to Genesis 10, 1 through 12. The Table of Nations. Okay, so as we read this is where the Bible introduces a number of key political players found throughout the rest of the Bible, including Nineveh and Babylon. Given what we know about the roles of these cities later on, what can we deduce from these texts? I'm going to go through this. It's a little long. And so just for my entertaining, I had Zachary read this when we were doing the lesson, and his translations of these names was, yeah, I had to go back and reread it because I'm like, I don't remember any of those names you just said. He was like putting P's where it should have been T's and E's where there should have been O's. Anyway, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, Togarmah. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittites, and the Rodanites. From these the maritime people spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. The Hamites. The sons of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush: Seba, Havilah, Saptah, Ramah, Saptica. The sons of Ramah: Sheba, and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, Kelna, and Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Kala, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Kala, which is the great city. All right. So, given what we know about the roles of some of these cities later on, what can we deduce from this text?
It was the start of people comparing themselves to God. They were on the cusp of this leader, that leader, this leader, that leader, this leader. And they were kind of moving away from praising God as that leader to Nimrod. Because it's like it says, the tables of nations. You look at these countries, one is, the spelling's wrong, but it was the start of Iraq. And, all that. And then they started branching off, and then here we come with kings.
So I struggled with the question there. I thought,
It was like a self-interest.
some of the cities I recognize, some of those cities rebelled against God and were ultimately destroyed. So I had wrote that. I did learn a lot about Nimrod, or I tried to. I'd never really studied Nimrod. The only thing I really knew about Nimrod, I've read the Bible several times, but I never picked up on the negative aspect of it here, and I think the lesson goes into it. Really? Yeah, so
I don't know why people say Nimrod.
yeah, maybe. Yeah, so and so the exposure that stuck in my brain over the years is the Egypt to Canaan question. Who was the mighty hunter? The answer is Nimrod. And so that's as in-depth as my study of Nimrod had ever been. But I started looking because, the Bible, the lesson here talks about what you just said is some have read about Nimrod and concluded that he is a noble hero, much like the conquering heroes of pagan mythology. But when the Bible describes him as a mighty one on the earth and a mighty hunter before the Lord, it is not a compliment. Nimrod is great in his own estimation, and he stands before the Lord in the sense that he defies God. What we see in these texts is the spreading of the rebellion against God, a rebellion that will exist until ultimately all rebellion will be forever eradicated. Now, go ahead.
Did you see in this right that you just read right there, did you see a rebellion spirit? A rebellious spirit?
In Nimrod? Not when I first read it. I had to Google it.
Talk about the last part of it. Did you see a rebellious spirit? No, you're standing for God.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, the Bible does say, and I never put two and two together, and I don't know if this is accurate. I looked it up, and some scholars and historians say it, but they say that Nimrod oversaw the construction of the Tower of Babel, you know, because that land was in his province. So if you go and look here, the first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, Kalnar, and Shinar. Well, the Tower of Babel fell in those territories, and it's like historians now don't you'll need to do your own research, but a lot of scholars and historians say that he oversaw the Tower of Babel. Yeah, it was in, but
That's a big excavation right now. I just Stan and I were talking about this, and if they ever have peace in the Middle East, this is why I don't think it'll ever happen. The site they think about Babylon, and they did a drone thing from the top, and it's just astronomically huge. But it's in Iraq, and you can't get in there. Archaeologists they're very, very limited on who they let to it. And they had one uprising where they actually some sect took land excavators, went through there and defaced a lot of the stuff, a lot of the artifacts. But I mean, like it dates back to back to Nimrod. He oversaw and they were talking about how it was built and everything, and it was phenomenal.
so I'd never put that together with that, and so don't quote me or don't trust what I say. Do your own research. But that's what I had read, that what Emma was saying, that he was responsible somewhat for that, and that's showing rebellion against God to even build that tower in the first place.
The last two lines here in our report here at the bottom of page 31 says, what we see in these texts is the spreading of the rebellion against God. That's the rebellious spirit. It says a rebellion that will exist until upward all rebellion will be forever eradicated.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about, a rebellious spirit.
So I mean, I see it, but I don't know if it's the spreading of the cities, and I guess what the author of the lesson is saying is that the rejection of God as the only ruler and the acceptance of these city-states, like not kings so much. There may have been kings of these city-states, but there was definitely a political oversight. And so instead of listening to God as the only ruler, they had mayors or kings.
What made him have a rebellious spirit? When he built that tower, he wanted to set himself up as God.
Yeah.
Look out over everything and be a thing that people would look at.
Right.
Set himself up as a God.
So these cities and people these sons setting themselves up to take the place of God. But, you know, it's kind of odd. I don't quite get it. You know, these are God-fearing, God-believing people, you know, or at least you would think, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I mean, they just got off the boat, you know. The world was just flooded, and yeah, and then then they
said, this is what God is.
Yeah.
I mean, Noah knew what was supposed to happen, but as they branched out, separated, went this way, that way, people's minds changed. I mean, it's incredible how you can put that to really what's going on in this country today.
Right.
Makes you wonder, Satan was he on the ark and come off?
He was there. He was absolutely there. I mean, when do you think he came to Earth? I mean, he was there.
Yes.
My Bible is the NIV, and I agree with her.
Yeah.
And
Shem. Yeah. So there was goodness. There was obviously some goodness that came off the boat, but back to Satan, the big deceiver, there was some bad off the boat as well. Right. And so, why is the sin of rebellion against God more subtle than we might realize? And the sin of rebellion, how can we protect ourselves against this very human trait? It's a tough question. I mean, we know that Satan's the king of lies and deception, and he can turn something good into something bad. And I think the lesson hints at it a little bit, but some of these man-made governments, they may try to be good, but ultimately are bad. Is what the lesson's saying.
I saw something yesterday, and it struck me because I was doing this lesson, and it said, and I wrote it down. It says, God's gift to the church was certainty. It gives the church strength. One fear above all others is the certainty. Certainty is the enemy of unity. Certainty is like the deadly enemy of tolerance. Faith, etc. It's a living thing because it walks hand in hand with doubt. If there was only certainty in the church, there would be no mystery, there would be no need for faith. If you're absolutely certain of this, why would you bother to walk the path? Why would you bother to obey the laws? Why would you bother to do anything? If you knew for certain, at the end of time, you're going to heaven.
I think
they said certainty is one of the biggest enemies of the church.
Certainty, and I think that's what we're about to talk about in Monday is that certainty. So, the people where there was no certainty, they didn't know what the leadership was going to look like, and so they called for a king. So we'll just jump into the lesson in the Bible because it may explain that better than I will. So Abraham's call. In the 10th chapter of Genesis, we see the birth of various nations. The word usually translated nations is goyim, which also can refer to Gentiles. Genesis 10 tells us that the human race divided up into land, languages, families, and nations. Almost immediately after the introduction of this concept, God calls Abraham out of one of those nations to be different from them and from what they represent. I may be on the wrong. I may have thought it's a different lesson that I'm thinking of. Okay. So Genesis 12, 1 through 9 says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.' So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev." So why did God call Abram out from his country of origin? It's not a trick question. So my family came up with God wanted to create a separate set of people to be known as God's people and to show the surrounding people, when God's goodness, when they trust in God, what it would look like. They would be an example. Yeah, I mean, we're still, obviously God knows what he's doing because we still know about these people. They were so set apart from all the others that we're still reading and talking about them. So God intended to use Abraham to establish a nation that would stand in contrast to human kingdoms. And we just read about the human kingdoms. They were not to have a king other than God himself. The people were to show what would happen if the human race returned to their Creator. Israel was established to be a blessing to all families of the earth. God had poured out upon the Israelites light and privileges that had not been seen in the world since perhaps before the flood. Now we're going to go to Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 9. And as I read, what was the Lord telling the children of Abraham, the nation that had become a fulfillment of the promise God had made to Abraham? 4, 5 through 9 says, See, I have taught you decrees and laws, sorry, I thought of something funny. Okay. See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering, to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all the decrees and say, Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? Only be careful and watch yourselves closely, so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. So what is the Lord telling the children of Abraham? Any answers? It's really easy.
The Hebrews were the firstborn, so to speak. They were the firstborn. They came out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. And then they spent 40 years. You know, see a story that has come to mind. Christ was born. They came out of Egypt. He was baptized in the Jordan. And then he wandered in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. That's the story. That's the old and the new. And that's why Israel has always been called the firstborn. And that's why a lot of people have a lot of theories about that. But anyway.
And the thing here is he's saying,
Yep.
Keep your eyes on God, and don't forget the things that your eyes have seen, or let them slip from your heart. So don't forget. Teach them to your children. And we all know the story. Do they forget? It's so hard. You know, it's so hard to imagine, to be able to see these miracles, like, and then a week later, a month later, it's like, oh, that didn't happen. I'm just going to do this thing that I'm not supposed to do. It's so wild. I guess we do it too, just in different ways. Yeah. Yep.
Whatever it was.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that Red Sea was only about foot deep. How can you destroy a whole army?
Was that the children's lesson last week?
I don't know. That's what I was
Jeff? Yeah, it was some people, if you weren't here last week, I'll butcher Jeff's children's story, but the doubter, or I can't remember who it was, but was trying to argue the point about the army being destroyed and saying, or the people crossing the river. Well, it wasn't that deep of a river, and the little boy was saying, "Wow," and it's like, why are you saying wow? You could have walked over that river. And it's like, well, God destroyed an entire army with a trickle of water. Wow, So either way you look at it, it was a miraculous event. Yeah, it doesn't. So this was not a single individual bearing witness in a single community. So this was an entire nation that, by working together in cooperation with God, could exhibit the glory of his character. Notice too in the words spoken to them that it wasn't just statutes and judgment that God had given them that made them so special, but their adherence to them that would cause the other nations to say, Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. However wonderful the truths given to the people, their failure to live up to them, to obey them, would bring curses instead of blessing and death instead of life. And then the personal question is, how does the same principle, that of not just knowing these truths, but obeying them, apply to us as Adventists today? I mean, I think it doesn't just apply to Adventists, but to everybody. You know, when God gives you a message, he gives you the message, and when you understand it, the understanding is, if I follow what I've been taught, there's great blessings from that. And if I don't, then not so great blessings, like with the people in that time.
That word right there in that last verse that you read, Adventist today, Adventist, what is the definition of Adventist?
Looking forward to the return of Jesus. Yep. So everyone's an Adventist. Or should be. Yep. Everyone should be looking forward to Jesus' second coming. But yeah, and that's a personal question, but you know, you can think about that. Do you have anything in your life that you know is wrong, or you're not sure about, that may need warrant some more study to try to address it in your life? We won't go over that unless somebody wants to come up front and start teaching for me. All right. So on to Tuesday, given what you asked for. As originally established, Israel was not to have a human monarch the way that other nations did. In time, however, the people's faith faltered. Now we're talking about what Emma was talking about. The people's faith faltered, and they found themselves pining for the things that the other nations, the Gentiles, had. We're going to read 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 18. Okay. So all the elders of Israel gathered together, and this is what I was laughing about earlier. Zachary was helping me read the lesson, and he started reading, and I'm listening to him, and then I asked the question. I'm like, I didn't get to answer that question at all on what you just read, Zachary. You know, he had read like a completely different chapter of the Bible. It was funny. Okay, 4 through 18. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them." Listen, God's saying, listen to the people. Warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." So this is where we... Yep. And that's where... Yeah.
Never put the kind of faith that you have in God in a person that's ever burn you.
Right. And this is what we're talking about, the whole faith and certainty. So the people of Israel were afraid. Samuel here. So the Bible says Samuel's sons did not follow his ways. And so the people of Israel were worried. I'm putting myself in their shoes. I'm trying to figure it out. So if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But, the people were like, well, who's going to lead us now? Because Samuel was in contact with God, and God was kind of giving them commands through Samuel. Samuel's sons weren't really following that life. And the people were like, well, what are we going to do? Instead of trusting in God, that God had a plan in place, they're like, well, God hasn't given us that plan yet, so we're going to go ahead and do it our way. We need a king to lead us. Samuel, you're old. What? They did. They lacked faith. They weren't relying on God. God had already been giving them everything they needed. And yep. Right. So they did not hold on to that faith. So as God had commanded them back in Deuteronomy to keep your eyes on God and don't forget, here in 1 Samuel, the people have forgotten. So they're not trusting in God. They're telling Samuel, hey, give us a king. And that's pretty, not very respectful at all of your God. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
I think one of the subtle things that was happening there is we want to be like everybody else. And, you think of the thing, they meet you in the marketplace and they say, well, who's your king? Oh, we don't have a king. Really?
Yeah.
And they lack faith, and so then, we want a king so we can be like everybody else.
Yeah. Right.
How many times in the last 20 years has anybody heard in the news how the United States needs to become more like the European? We need to be more this. We need to be more that. We need to be more this. We need to be more that. We need to be more accepting. We need to take in this, that, this, that. There's a thing on TV right now about the conclave. It's about a pope died. Funny song right now. And they're picking a new pope. And they have this one guy, he's from America. And he said, look, if you're going to canvass for me, he tells 135 popes, this is what I stand for. Okay, marriage, women, and the church, blah, 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 blah. He goes, it's not going to change. So if you're going to vote for me, put my name in that little white, in the little pot there. This is what I stand for, and my message is not going to change. And that's what it is. He's wanting them to follow that.
Yeah.
And that's what, it says, in what ways do we fall into similar temptations? That's it.
Oh, yeah, I did answer that. I said everyone else was doing it. And then I kind of expanded on my answer, and I wrote that maybe they saw how others were living and, how Satan deceives us. And maybe these people were seeing, like, all the, I don't want to say fun, but, living life in sin, and maybe it looked appealing from the outside,
I'm sure it does.
when
What was it? The Netherlands gave everybody a living wage. And they said, oh, it was great. People loved it. They gave everybody a check,
Yeah.
a living wage. And it was in hopes that they would still work a little bit, but they could do this and this and this. And then they said, oh, we need to be all inclusive. We got the Euro, no borders, blah, blah, blah. Well, now everybody's got a fence up somewhere, somehow keeping,
Right.
They saw how it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
and I don't quite know what all the laws and what was going on in the city states around them, but if these were God's people, so I imagine that these people were living a little more purely, or a lot more pure. They were living the way God had called them to be, whereas their neighbors may have been, I don't know, I'll just throw out some examples, but living life, having massive parties, drinking, dancing, etc. And they saw that type of life, and maybe it was appealing to their sinful nature. Obviously, we as Christians know that type of life is not a wholesome, joyful life. It may be fun in the moment, but the next day is not so great. But they saw that type of life and like, hey, that looks fun. And, they kind of said, hey, I want to, if I have a man king instead of a God king, maybe these restrictions on entertainment will lessen. This is just me philosophizing or trying to put myself in these shoes. But yeah. Right.
Well, I mean, God knew what was going to happen here.
He warned them.
Yeah, he knew what was going to happen. You start appointing an individual, a king, he's going to do just what they said he was. He's going to take a tenth of, as like it says, the taxation, military. He's going to start doing everything, telling you what to do, blah 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 blah.
And at the end, he talks about taking like the best of your vineyards and stuff. Because that's where that whole, even the best man of God is still in a sinful body, and those desires are going to be there. Now I have this power. Why don't I take advantage of it a little bit? So, we're probably all guilty of sin obviously in our lives, but you put someone in that much power, there's a lot to be tempted with. And so God knows it's going to happen. He warns them, you put a man in charge, as good as he tries to be. We see some great kings with David. We know what David did. So, all right, so what is important here to notice that the request for a king was a rejection of God's reign over his people. As established, the nation was to answer directly to the Creator. So this was the people that God had set apart to answer to him and not a king. So their relationship to him was put on display through the sanctuary and its services, among other things. By requesting a king, they would bring the same kinds of sufferings on themselves that the Gentile kingdoms experience: military conscription in the king's war, confiscation, taxation, and other ills. They would discover that human potentates tend to rule in their own favor instead of benevolently as God does. So a man's going to rule in his best interest. Right. Yeah. So the new arrangement would be permanent. Israel was going to get what they asked for, but when they realized that it was a downgrade, they would be stuck with it. I thought that was funny. Yeah. It's sad. You can put yourself in that position. It's kind of comical, but, you go buy something and you realize you spent all your money and it was a downgrade. That feeling of, oh man, what have I done? So you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. God knows the weakness of his people, and he predicted early on that Israel would request a human king. They did, and as so much of sacred history is a story of consequences of that choice, like what you were talking about. So notice in Deuteronomy 17, notice that God does not say, I will give them a king, but rather his people decided that they want one. God put safeguards in place to protect his people from some of the evils of human government, though as the history of the nation and its king showed, the safeguards were often ignored. One simply has to look at the history of Israel after they decided to have a king in order to see just how badly things went for them under these kings. Some kings were better than others, as we were talking about earlier. But even the good ones had done some wrong, And he's one of the best kings. He was beloved by God, but committed a premeditated murder. And if you're struggling right now and don't think you can be forgiven, just look at David. I mean, it's pretty powerful. In many cases, the nation. Now wait, I take that back. You're forgiven, but God does still. What's the word? He is just, but he doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. So Israel, David, they were still punished. They're forgiven. They were still punished. So I lost my spot. Okay, in many occasions, the nations lived under the rule of one king after another who did evil in the sight of the Lord. Back then, or even today, all human governments share one thing in common: sinners governing other sinners. What could possibly go wrong in that situation? Blind leading the blind. We're all sinners. Okay, so the rulers of the Gentiles. God's dealing with Israel provides rich insights into his dealing with the New Testament church. In fact, in many ways, the nation of Israel served to foreshadow the errors of the church. Far from being able to claim any kind of superiority to ancient Israel, Christians have been and still are very susceptible to the same temptations. So we're going to jump over to Matthew. (20) 25 through 28. And as I read here, what error did Jesus warn his disciples to avoid in establishing the work of the Christian church? So Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So, what was Jesus warning his disciples to avoid? Not to look for a kingly. It was hard for me to answer the question, but I think what it was saying is he was warning the church not to be rulers exercising authority, but to be a servant to the people. I can't remember who said it at potluck last week, but I was talking to someone and they were saying that, when the top of the church is like being, I don't want to call it a dictator, but rulers exercising authority. Yes.
Well, and then again, and England, when they broke from the Roman Catholic Church, they started their own church, and that whole thing was because the king wanted to have his marriage dissolved, so he could marry somebody else. I mean, that's the example there. The church has ruled people's lives. I mean, look at between the Protestants and the Catholics and Belfast and all that stuff. I mean, it's been a battle back and forth. And they're forgetting the role of the church.
And I think the church needs to serve the people, not the people serving, not the church exactly, but the head of the church, or the leaders of the church hierarchy. Because, we need to serve the church in the fashion that we need to accomplish the church's mission, as requested by God and Jesus, to go out and to preach to other nations and stuff. So that is the church's message. But back to kings and leaders, we're not going out and working for the man, so to speak. Yeah, the Protestant system instead of the Roman system. Yep. Yeah, he was. Mm. Right. Yes. Correct. Yeah, because the people, we're all sinners leading sinners. We're all human, and if I come up here and tell you something that's wrong, you call me out. Don't ask me to come up here anymore. Or at least correct me, because I don't admit to saying I know everything by any means. Good. Politics. Yep. All right, so Israel asked for a human king, a request that led to the moral downfall of the nation. The kings became progressively more wicked until God allowed the Babylonians to take his people captive as a matter of course correction. Something similar happened in the history of the Christian church. Even though they were not to structure themselves like a Gentile nation, when Constantine came to power and professed to be a Christian, believers were relieved. Persecution was now ended. That in itself was a blessing. But then it occurred to the church that they might be able to leverage the power of the emperor to their own advantage. Several major disputes broke out among Christians in the 4th century, and when the church found itself incapable of resolving them, it allowed the emperor to intervene. Gradually, the Bishop of Rome rose in prominence, where he had once been a senior bishop among equals. The church allowed the state to intervene in the religious matters, and once the state had a foot in the door, things went from bad to worse. Like Israel of old, many of the darkest chapters in Christian history are the direct result of the church compromising with the world. Where Israel turned to idol worship and her kings were corrupted by their appetite for power, to the point of offering their children to idols. The church gradually adopted many of the means and methods of a pagan empire, to the point that many faithful believers were martyred because they were perceived as threats to the church-state institution. So they were killed to protect the hierarchy, like what we were saying. Protecting a hierarchy. Yep. So the primary purpose for which God established the nation of Israel was not to condemn the rest of the world, but to save it. Certainly, most of us feel condemned when we are confronted by righteous behavior in someone else. So the existence of Israel also served to highlight the sin and selfishness of the nations around it. Believers living in harmony with God highlight his righteous character, which naturally leads to conviction. Ideally, the lives of people who keep the commandments of God should showcase his character. Right. So God had set apart Israel to, be their king, their guiding, and he wanted to set them apart so that the other nations around him would see what God had done for these people and want what they had, and come to God. He wanted to save all people. And he calls us to do the same thing. So, I obviously can't impact the president or our nation, but I can impact the people that are in my life. And so, we need to be that example that God made out of Israel. We need to be that example and live our lives where people see us and say, hey, I want what that guy's got, or I want what she's got, and then that's how we win people. So the lesson says, however, had the Israelites acted as they should have and done what they had been told to do, the nations would have come to them in peace, seeking to know more about them and their God. So just put yourself in place of the Israelites there. However, had Rocky acted as he should have and done what I had been told to do, the people around me would come to me in peace, seeking to know more about me and my God. So, tragically, as the Babylonian captivity showed, these nations came to wage war instead. The ultimate showcase of God's character, of course, was Jesus, the only human who has perfectly demonstrated it. But his perfect example, which certainly brought convictions to hearts, was intended as an invitation. The ultimate purpose for establishing the nation of Israel was the same as God's purpose in establishing the church. He longs to use his people to draw sinners toward Christ. The call of the three angels' message delivered through the church goes out not to a select few people, but to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. Revelation 18:1 predicts that the whole earth will be lit up with the glory of God prior to Christ's return. So, how much time do I have? No time. All right, so personal study, if you haven't done them for today. What do the following teach us about God's intended role for his people in the world, and how can we apply these principles to ourselves?
Numbers is about forgiveness. Isaiah is how we should be a light, and Revelation is a warning if we need to come out of sin or receive the punishment.
Judges. I'm looking at my answers. I can't even read my own writing.
You can barely.
Oh, I think... Oh, I'd marked out my answer. I guess I didn't like my first answer. Slow to anger. I can't read that. Something about love and forgiveness. But he does not leave the guilty unpunished. So he gives us all the love and forgiveness. So we should show our fellow person love and forgiveness. It's not necessarily in our right to do the punishment. That God holds that, but God does not leave the guilty unpunished. God will keep you, and he wants us to teach all people, be a light to other people. So that's a good way to end it. So this week, be a light. Well, this year, this life, be a light to other people. Okay, let's end in a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you so much for the Bible and for the lessons that it has given us and instructions to be a light to others. Please help us not to fail so many times. Please help us to learn from the Israelites and to be a good example and to not lose our faith. We love you and thank you, and be with us the remainder of the Sabbath day. Amen.